Decided I wanted to quote something that was written back in 1892. It was written by a very radical socialist back in 1892, and he hoped that by reciting these words, people all over the country would start reciting these phrases, and they'd start saying them, and that this could be the basis for a mass movement in the United States that would totally reorient the economic system to work in the interest of the people of the country, and would also get rid of racism. So, are you ready for these very radical words that were written back in 1892 by a very, very radical socialist? Yeah. Well, I think they're quite familiar to folks here in the room. They go like this. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So I bet you didn't know that Francis Bellamy, the author of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance, was a socialist. He was actually a socialist. He was a Baptist minister. He was a Baptist minister in Boston, and his sermons were so radical that they were actually, he was banned from the pulpit. He wasn't allowed to preach in the city of Boston, so he moved to Florida. And he had a bit of a problem because he refused to preach to segregated congregations. He didn't believe in racism and segregation, so he couldn't preach in Florida either. So it's an interesting history. I want to say this, when I was in Cleveland, there was a local activist named Cheryl Lesson, and she was a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Maoist group, and she went to prison for 2 years for lighting an American flag on fire. And that was wrong. And there's been various attempts to outlaw flag burning in the United States, and I would be the first to protest against that. People have the right to express themselves in that way. And I will add that the first people to burn the flag in protest in the United States were African Americans. It was Marcus Garvey. And while I think that proletarian patriotism and such is a very good strategy that we should adopt, I respect the right of any colonized person, any black person, any Chicano person, any indigenous person to burn the flag, to say that they are not an American, to argue that they need to have their self-determination and a national territory. And that my belief in proletarian patriotism as an overall strategy is not a negation of that in any conceivable way, right? And I want to also talk about how cheap some of this can be, right? Because I support all black nationalism, whether it's the Uhuru movement, Minister Farrakhan, the MOVE organization. I support all black nationalism, and a lot of the people criticizing us don't. I support all anti-imperialist states: Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, any country that's fighting for its independence against imperialism. I support them. A lot of people criticizing us don't. And that this, demonstration of I hate America, I want nothing to do with America, oh, look how revolutionary I am, is really fake if you don't actually support black nationalism, if you don't actually support Iran and Cuba and Venezuela, if you accuse people who criticize the Syrian anti-Syria propaganda about chemical weapons, if you accuse them of being Nazis, you have no right to criticize us on that ground and say we're pro-imperialist because we won't tweet, F the USA on social media. And that it's really kind of childish to think that you can make up for not really being anti-imperialist in your politics by virtue signaling with this, this kind of teenage rebellion verbiage, which is what a lot of this really is. Because at the end of the day, support for actual anti-imperialist forces, that's what makes you anti-imperialist.
And I see that, a lot of leftists take this lesson from people in Iran, from people all over the world who burn the American flag. And, I have no qualms with them. If they want to burn the American flag, hey, that's up to them. Go ahead, burn the flag. That is the primary contradiction in imperialized countries is imperialism. And the United States is an occupying force. So if you want to burn the American flag, whatever, that's your prerogative. But they're not trying to build socialism in the United States, and it's not their job to build socialism in the United States. It's our job. So for an American person, a person that's living in this country at the least, to be doing that when our job is to be building socialists, if you're going to call yourself a communist and your whole goal is to be building socialism, you can't burn your own flag. What are you doing? You're setting up an unnecessary wall between you and your own people. And as communists, we need to be taking that down. And that is the one of the weirdest things that I see. that a lot of, and I did it myself because I, like so many others, was virtue signaling. I thought that this is the best way to be the most revolutionary, hate your country. Ooh, look, I'm just like those Iranians. I'm just like those Palestinians. I'm not a Palestinian person. I'm not an Iranian person. And they're building their own struggle, and power to them and solidarity with you to do that. But my job is to be fighting against the state that's hurting theirs. And so if I'm being counterproductive to building an actual working class movement in my own country, am I actually helping them, or am I just being a clown? Am I just being self-centered? And that's really what it comes down to. And it's so hard to have this conversation with other leftists because they're just like, no, you just don't get it. Like, oh, we got to be in solidarity. You can be in solidarity with those people through real work, through really trying to change the class dynamic here, the class structure here, the change of the state. Get our troops out of there. And the way that you do that is not out of this place of hatred and contempt for your fellow worker. It is a place of love and wanting to unite and building together. And I'm sorry, but you going to any, non-politicized person and say death to your nationality is really not going to work. I mean, some people might like it. The very vast minority of people are going to like it. And I think that also social media and online culture has really contributed to this stuff, because you'll see people who, make these really awful, incorrect takes, and maybe it gets a lot of traction. But you think about it, what is it getting? 2,000 retweets, 2,000 likes? This is a country of nearly 400 million people. Okay, that 2,000 stuff, that's not even a city. That's like the block radius over here in Brooklyn. So I'm sorry, we gotta wisen up.
The last time I saw this brother, we were in a hotel in Bandar Abbas. He was about to get on a boat to risk his life to take aid, humanitarian aid, to the starving people of Yemen. He's here representing the organization FIST. Fight imperialism, stand together. Please join me in welcoming Caleb Maupin. Please come to the stage. Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Well, the last time I saw Cyrus, I was in a hotel in Bandar Abbas, and I was getting on a boat, and we were trying to go to Yemen. Our boat was full of medical supplies, humanitarian aid, food, flour, things that people in Yemen desperately need. And we weren't able to complete our mission. We never got to Yemen. And why was that we did not complete our mission? On the day that we were supposed to arrive in Yemen, the Saudis bombed the port of Hodeidah, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 8 times in a single day. They bombed the port of Hodeidah. We were unable to complete our mission. We were unable to deliver flour and medical supplies to the people of Yemen because Saudi terrorism prevented us from delivering the supplies. You wouldn't know it now. You wouldn't know it if you were watching TV. You can watch CNN, MSNBC, Fox for hours, and they don't even say Yemen. But around the clock, every single day, Yemen is being bombed. It's being bombed by the Saudi military. But every single one of those bombs is given to them and sold to them by the United States. Pentagon generals are on the scene directing the Saudi attack on Yemen. This attack on Yemen, it shouldn't just be understood as a Saudi attack on Yemen. The bombing of Yemen that is destroying hospitals, destroying schools, destroying power plants and civilian infrastructure that's already killed at least 4,000 people. The bombing of Yemen that's taking place is a U.S. military operation. It's an Israeli military operation. It's being done to serve imperialism and Zionism.
I would like to add that, okay, first of all, we need to differentiate between a number of things, because as soon as you say this, you get immediately people start throwing a whole bunch of things and conflating a whole bunch of things at you. Okay, patriotism just means loving the land in which you live, wanting life to get better for the land or country in which you live. Patriotism refers specifically to a country, right? That's what it means. That's all patriotism means. That's patriotism. Nationalism is a different concept. Nationalism is loyalty to a nation. And the United States is not a nation. It's not a nation state. It's not Scotland. It's not France. It's not Germany. We are not, we don't have the attributes of a nation here. We don't have a common culture, a common background, a common language even. So we're not a nation. So you can't be a nationalist for the United States. And on top of that, national chauvinism is the belief that your nation or your nationality is superior to other nations and discriminating against other nations. So when you say you're a patriot, you're not being a nationalist, and you're definitely not being a national chauvinist. You're simply saying you want a better life and a better future for the country. And what is so frustrating is that that people seem to argue that, oh, saying you're a patriotic American, that means blah, 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 blah. That means, oh, that you don't, blah, 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 blah. You don't recognize the country was founded on slavery. You don't, and it's like, no, all that means is we want a better life for the country. And at the end of the day, you can't really be an American patriot without being an internationalist. If you're really patriotic to this country, you want imperialism dismantled. You want a better relationship with countries around the world and an end to the exploitation of the third world. You want global relations based on win-win cooperation. You want an end to these wars. You want to break up the big corporations. That's really loving America. And if you're truly an internationalist, if you truly want what's good for the world, you would want the United States to move towards socialism and dismantle imperialism. And so there's no contradiction whatsoever. To truly be patriotic to this country, you must be an internationalist and an anti-imperialist. To truly be an anti-imperialist and an internationalist, you must be patriotic to this country. There is absolutely no confusion there. There's no contradiction between these terms.
In the United States, we often hear jokes, people all over the world, and I think we do it ourselves, where Americans are so dumb, Americans are so ignorant, Americans don't know geography. And, I don't think that any people, any nationality is inherently dumb or not. I think that the American working class has been robbed of education. We've been robbed of knowing different parts of the world, so much so that we've been robbed of our own history, like understanding who Thomas Paine was, like understanding the history of International Workers' Day or International Women's Day, and so forth. We've been robbed of this opportunity because an ignorant population is a submissive population. It is the best way to, keep us in the dark, keep us individualistic, non-communitarian, and therefore we'll never question, we'll never rise up. We'll just consume whatever they feed us. And unfortunately, a lot of the American left has also fed into that. They don't want to talk about the history of, the great worker struggles that have happened in this country, the great resistors.
But Trump says, he's going to make America great again, right? And that he's going to put this big tariff on China. He's going to cut us out from one of the fastest moving economies in the world. He's not going to collaborate with them on technology, and somehow that's going to make the economy better. And I know there are a lot of people in this country that really want to believe him. They're not here in New York City, obviously, but there's a lot of people around the country who are in neighborhoods devastated by opioids, who have seen a rise in crime in their neighborhood, have seen the good-paying industrial jobs go away, and they want to believe him, and they're rallying around him. And there are some of us also, who've gone down that, that Howard Zinn, Cornell West, Noam Chomsky corridor, right? That little rabbit hole. And we know about the history of the United States, and we know about slavery, and we know about the slaughter of the indigenous people, and we know about the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And some of us, when we hear that slogan, "Make America Great Again," it just hits us in our gut. It just makes us sick, and we just get angry. It's like, what does he mean, make America great again? Is he going to do slavery all over again? Right? Is he going to do the Korean War again and kill another million people? Is he going to bring back Jim Crow? What is he talking about? Make America great again. It just bothers us. It just, there's this rage. All my life. I remember when I was a college student, I would argue with people about politics. We'd be arguing about like the Iraq War or economics or something. And somebody would just blurt out, "America's a good country, okay?" And I'd be like, what does that have to do with anything? Right? And they'd be like, well, America, and it's this stupid jingoism that we get in the USA, that because of America, because of patriotism, you're not allowed to question the government, you have to go along with it, you're not allowed to oppose capitalism because of this stupid jingoism. And it makes you angry. And if you're somebody who can see through the lies, it makes you angry to hear that, right? And that's why a lot of leftists, I think, are out there burning American flags and are out there saying things like America was never great, right? It's a reaction. It's rage in response to that stupid jingoism that says you're not allowed to question the government because of American patriotism. But you won't ever catch me doing that kind of thing anymore. And I'm going to tell you why. I'll tell you why. In 2015, I went to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it was a life-changing experience for me. And in 2015, not only did I get to visit Iran, but I participated in a humanitarian mission. I went on a boat from Iran to Yemen, and it was a boat from the Red Crescent Society, and we were trying to bring humanitarian aid to the people of Yemen who are being bombed, and still to this day, bombed and destroyed by Saudi Arabia. I was on this ship for 13 days. And when you're on a ship for 13 days and you're the only American on the ship And there's only about 10 people on the ship who can speak any English. And you're seeing American warplanes flying above, and you're seeing Saudi jets, and you're hearing reports about what's happening, and you're on your way to a war-torn country. That makes you think a lot. And your mind really starts to delve into spiritual matters, and what does your life mean, and what is it all about? And we never reached Hodeidah, which was the port we were going to. And the reason we never reached it was because they bombed the port of Hodeidah 8 times in a single day on the day we were supposed to arrive. Killed all kinds of dock workers. And on top of that, they bombed the medical university in Hodeidah. And they killed medical students who were doing nothing but wanting to help other Yemeni people. And they killed them. And obviously, with the port that we were going to destroyed, and so many people dead, and reports that we would be attacked when we arrived, we had to turn the ship around. And we ended up going to Djibouti. And that was quite an interesting experience, my escape from Djibouti. I'll tell that story someday, but I'm not going to tell it today. Anyway, I got back to Iran. And when I got back to Iran, they gave me the opportunity to do something that very, very few Americans have ever done. And I actually got to see the supreme leader of Iran, the Grand Ayatollah Ali Syed Khamenei. And I was in this auditorium with about 20,000 people, and I was about 100 feet away from the supreme leader of Iran. That's something very few Americans have ever experienced. And I remember, I was there, and I was with a lot of Chinese diplomats and diplomats from Africa, and we all had our earpieces on, and we're standing there in our suits, and we're very formal, and some of us had chairs, and we're standing there. And usually when I would go to Iran, I was surrounded by the wealthiest people in the country, like artists, writers, people that worked at TV networks, and people who worked for think tanks. But when I was in this auditorium, with 20,000 people there to see the leader of the Islamic Revolution, I wasn't seeing the rich kids of Tehran. I was seeing working class Iranians. And when he came out onto the balcony, when the supreme leader of Iran came out onto the balcony, he just walks out onto the balcony, the most gentle, he wasn't doing anything dramatic, just walks out. This audience just screamed in adoration. And people started sobbing and moving back and forth. And it was like the most dramatic moment when the supreme leader walked into the room. And the reason for that was because if it weren't for the supreme leader of Iran, these people wouldn't have running water, and they wouldn't have electricity. They saw the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, they saw him as the one who fought for their interests against the rich and powerful. And so I stood there in this mausoleum with my earpiece on, and I listened to the speech. And it was interesting, because at the time, negotiations were taking place between the USA and Iran. The nuclear deal was taking place. So I stood there, and I'm listening to the conversation. And, he's going on. I remember he said that we oppose both the crimes of ISIS terrorists and the crimes of police brutality in the United States, because they're both the same, and you must always oppose brutality. And I remember he said that the westernized Islam that works with the USA and terrorist Islam are both distortions, and we have our true version in Iran. But there's one moment that I will never forget. One moment that just touched me, because he was talking about the negotiations that were taking place between the USA and Iran. And he said that, these negotiations are taking place, that he was allowing the USA and Iran to negotiate around the nuclear issue. He said, but the USA and Iran would never be allies, he said. And he said that Iran would never align with American imperialism. And then something happened that I will never forget. Is he said that, which is commonly said in Iran, he said that the USA was the great Satan. And then I was the only American in an audience of 20,000 people who all began chanting in unison, "Death to America, death to America." And I stood there, and I froze, and tears went down my cheeks. I was just overwhelmed. And I think back on that moment. You don't forget a moment like that. You don't. And I stood there, and I thought how horrible it is that this is what America means to people all over the world. They weren't chanting death to my family. They weren't chanting death to people who just want to get by. To them, America meant war, and it meant grinding countries into poverty, and it meant destruction. That's what America meant to them. And when I heard them chanting death to America, I thought, God damn it, how dare these people call themselves America? How dare the billionaires and the bankers that run this country call themselves America? These are the forces that would cut food to children in the Bronx so that they can build drones and destroy people and kill people in other countries. How dare they call themselves America? These are the people that sold America down the river with so many trade deals. These people have nothing to do with America. What they stand for is global financial dictatorship. And what people around the world need to know is that there's two Americas. Yes, there's an America of Wall Street billionaires and bankers, of militarists and prostitute politicians, sure. But there's another America. There's an America of people who just want to survive and feed their kids and live a decent life. There's an America of all the people who fought for social justice around the world and stood against empire and war. There's an America of all the people who've organized for women's rights and LGBT rights and so many struggles for justice that have taken place. There's another America. And no, now is not the time to say, make America great again. Now is the time to build a new America. I think that we need a government of action that will guarantee Americans the right to education and health care. That's what I think. I think we need a government of action that will nationalize the oil. Right now we're in the middle of an oil boom. You know, they're producing 11 million barrels of oil in the United States, more than ever before. With fracking, there's so much oil. But yet we don't see any of the profits from the oil. The people who get rich from our oil and from our gas are people named like Rockefeller, DuPont, and Carnegie. Well, we need a government of action that will say that's America's oil, that's America's gas, that's America's coal, that's America's timber, and it should be managed and the profits made from it should go to serve the people of America. We need a government of action that will work to provide education and actually, you know, there was a time where the United States was churning out some of the greatest scientists and engineers in the world. Why can't we be doing that now? Why are we so focused on bombing and destroying other countries?
What you see in Bolivia, what they're fighting for in Peru, what exists in Venezuela is the state that we are a nation of many different nations. And that is something that the United States 100%, I mean, cut and dry, that is us. We are a nation full of so many people. We have a comrade that's Iranian and Greek, I'm Peruvian, there's another one who's Ukrainian here, and so forth, and so many different nationalities. And yet we all still are united by our nationality as Americans, as part of the American working class. And I think that this is something that we need to look forward to and something that we can try to build instead of just this, and what I've been calling it a national nihilism. Oh, don't call me American. Well, leave the country. Go to, you know, when I went to Ukraine, they didn't see me as Peruvian, even though I'm brown. They didn't see me as that. They saw me as American. And, you know, I did benefit from that. I was a little bit safer than, you know, the Roma people who looked very similar to me. I was much safer than them. People wanted to come up and talk to me because I'm American, because I have this passport. You go throughout the world and you will realize how American you are. I mean, I definitely was the kind of person who was like, get me out of this country. I'm out. I hate America. Death to America. And I get to, you know, I took myself on a little birthday trip. I get to Hungary and I'm like, I'm feeling kind of lonely here. One, I don't speak Hungarian, and the only other English speakers I know here are the Brits. And like, you know, cool thing for you British people, but I miss my own people, right? And it wasn't like I was missing Peruvians. I was missing Americans to, you know, speak in colloquialisms, to, you know, just be one. Like we understand each other in a way because we have that similar, you know, background, our nation, our nationality. You know, I have much more in common with somebody like anywhere in Nebraska because of that, a working class person from Nebraska, than, you know, somebody from the other side of the world, even if they're working class too, because we're bound by this our culture. And there is an American culture. It's just the reality. I swear, don't believe me, leave the country, and you know, you're lying if you say that's not real.
Eugene Debs, the great socialist leader, he was arrested for giving an anti-war speech. He was put in prison for speaking up against World War I. And the speech that he was arrested for, which he gave, I mean, it's about the 100-year anniversary, contains this paragraph. And I want to read this paragraph from Eugene Debs' speech. And I do apologize, some of the language here is not modern. It's, you know, sexist, I guess you could say. But I'm just going to read this paragraph. He said, if you want to be respected, you have to begin by respecting yourself and look yourself in the face and see a man. Do not allow yourself to fall into the predicament of the poor fellow who, after he'd heard a socialist speech, concluded that he ought to be a socialist. The argument that he heard was unanswerable.
Yes, he said to himself, all the speaker said was true, and I certainly ought to join the Socialist Party. But then after a while, he concluded that by joining the party, he might anger his boss and lose his job. And then he concluded, I can't take that chance. And that night he slept alone. And there was something on his conscience, and it resulted in a dreadful dream. Men always have such dreams when they betray themselves. But a socialist is free to go to bed with a clear conscience. He goes to sleep with his manhood, and he awakens and walks forth in the morning with self-respect. He is unafraid, and he can look the whole world in the face without a tremor and without a blush. That's Eugene Debs. Now, people don't talk that way anymore. And I think the reason, that people don't talk that way anymore is because we've lost that notion. He's referring to the idea that people can make themselves better people by being part of a mass movement and organizing to build a better world. That's been lost in our society at this point. People still worry about themselves, people worry how they are, but instead it feeds into a kind of chronic narcissism with Facebook and Twitter, and people worry who they are, but this notion that we can be better people by coming together and organizing for a better world, it seems to have been lost in our society.
We shouldn't accept that all these things that have gone on in the history of the United States that were absolutely evil and wrong benefited the country. Slavery, for example, held back the industrialization and economic development of the United States. And that was one of the main motivations for the Civil War. The industrial capitalists were furious about the fact that in the South, they maintained an agrarian economy without industrialization. And there was a clash between the semi-feudal slave economy of the South and the rising industrial economy of the North. And if you look at the US South, the reason that even today, hundreds of years later, it is still poorer than the rest of the United States, it's still largely agrarian, it's still less developed, is because of the legacy of slavery. Now, that's not to say that wealthy white plantation owners didn't benefit from slavery, but if you look at the US South, overwhelmingly, the majority of the population of white people weren't benefiting from it. Black people certainly weren't benefiting from it, being, murdered and exploited and worked to death. They weren't benefiting from it. But the majority of white people weren't benefiting from it because they had the lowest wages in the country because they were competing with people who worked for free. And slavery overwhelmingly was bad for white workers in the South. And the defeat of slavery was a victory for the US economy overall. It led to unleashing industrialization in the country. And this is what W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in his History of the United States. In his Black Reconstruction, he makes this point. And at the time that slavery was going on, it was labor unions and those who fought for the rights of workers that were the biggest opponents of slavery for this reason. Because even if these labor unionists were racists, they understood that slavery drove the wages of workers down. It hurt the U.S. economy. So by saying that that you can't be patriotic in the United States because of slavery, the strongest arguments against slavery at the time were being made by people who were arguing in the interests of the United States, and slavery hurt all working people in the United States. So that logic just doesn't add up. And this has been completely eroded. I watched, John Oliver, he did this piece about Confederate monuments. And if you watched the piece, you would think that slavery was good for Southern white people. It was good for Southern white people. They should just feel guilty about it. Well, that's bullcrap. It wasn't good for Southern white people. And the idea that slavery was good for Southern white people is propaganda that was invented by the Democratic Party. That was invented, Gone with the Wind, Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan. They did all of this stuff to rewrite history, to convince low-income white people that they were better off when slavery went on. But that was a big, fat lie. And liberals now go around repeating this as if this is a fact. Oh, yeah, well, slavery benefited all white people in the United States, and but they should just feel guilty and ashamed of this. That's not actually what went on. This whole narrative, I've often criticized the book To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a really nice story. It's very touching, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the anti-racist struggles of the 1930s, right? It's, you have this town in the South, and there are these black people, and these black people couldn't possibly fight for their own rights. They're just helpless victims, and they're just these passive, helpless victims. And then all the poor white people are a bunch of rednecks and racists and all of that. And the hero is this wealthy white lawyer with a heart of gold who just steps in and tries to hold back all those poor white rednecks from their racism. That's not what happened in the 1930s. It takes place in the 1930s before the Second World War in the South. At that time, the Communist Party was going to the South and building labor unions of sharecroppers and textile workers of black and white. And Gus Hall and William Z. Foster and those folks were going around the South, and they were saying that racism and Jim Crow hurt all working people, and that they needed to build a fighting labor movement for the rights of all working people, and that Jim Crow hurt all workers, and that putting the needs of the black people at the front of the class struggle was a way to liberate all workers. And it was the white rednecks who were joining the same labor unions as the African Americans and teaming up together that shut down the state of South Carolina in 1934 and caused the National Guard to be sent in. You read the history of what went on in Alabama. Go read Hammer and Hoe by Robin D.G. Kelly. And it was the white poor people and the black poor people standing together and understanding that racism hurt all workers and that putting the needs of black people at the front would lead to the liberation of all workers that made the wealthy white lawyers and made the businessmen and the bankers panic and made them panic and push racism and Ku Klux Klanism like you wouldn't believe, and also is part of what motivated Roosevelt to pass his popular reforms to try and calm the class struggle. So that's just, that book, To Kill a Mockingbird, it's not really about the 1930s. Every work of art reflects the period in which it was created, not the period in which it takes place. That reflects the mindset of the civil rights movement. And what was happening during the civil rights movement was that all over the world, in Africa and in Asia and in Latin America, the colonized people were breaking free. And they were breaking free, and the Soviet Union and China were the leaders of that global national liberation struggle. And to humiliate the United States and to expose the propaganda of the United States, they showed the picture of Emmett Till's mutilated body. They showed Jim Crow segregation, and they said the United States are a bunch of hypocrites. They say they believe in freedom. Look what they do to the black people. And in response to that, the richest capitalists in the northern wing of the Democratic Party, like the Kennedy family and others, said, okay, we need to fix this Jim Crow problem so we can have better optics. And that's what To Kill a Mockingbird is really about. It was the rich capitalists of the North saying, all right, we're going to go down south. Can you guys cut this out? We're trying to make them think we're the free country against the commies. That's what was really going on there. And that's what To Kill a Mockingbird is really about, okay? And this notion that the rich are the enlightened ones with the good values and the poor people are all a bunch of, racist white trash who were all in the Klan and the black people couldn't possibly fight for their own rights. Well, the only reason there was a civil rights movement was because before that, there was a black nationalist movement. There was Malcolm X. There was the Nation of Islam. And black nationalism and revolutionary politics was getting strong. That also motivated the northern wing of the Democratic Party to start working with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others. So this notion that black people can't fight for their own rights, that's false. This notion that poor white people are these racist rednecks that need the rich people to control them, that's false. The whole narrative we have around this is all false. And this feeds into the mindset. People might see our rally here today, see the Day of Al-Quds and think, what's he up here talking about Yemen? That's a completely different country. But it's not. It's all connected. Every major religion, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they all forbid what's called ribaud or usury, which is the way of making money by doing nothing, making money off investments. But what is Wall Street? Wall Street sits at the top of a global system based on ribaud and usury. They make money from nothing. They make money from nothing. They make money from impoverishing the world. And that's what we have to oppose. We have to oppose the global system of monopoly capitalism, where a few big bankers in London and in Wall Street control the world. Yemen is fighting for its independence. And I'll tell you another thing. Obama and the leaders of the U.S., they say that they want to stop ISIS, and they say they want to stop terrorism, and they say they want to spread democracy. But there's nothing democratic about Saudi Arabia. And what countries are actually defeating Daesh and ISIS? It's Iran and Syria. They're scoring real victories against them, and we can't even sign a peace treaty to end the sanctions on Iran. It's Iran and Syria that are fighting terrorism. It's the United States and Saudi Arabia that are spreading terrorism all over the world. A lot of American communists, the way they see this is that, they feel they don't fit in with this country, which I've felt that way my whole life. And many people feel alienated, especially now with the economy in crisis. A lot of young folks don't have a decent job and there's a lot of social alienation and confusion and they don't feel like they fit in. So they adopt Marxism so they can say, I'm the good American. All the Americans around me, you're evil. You're supporting the empire. You're Euro settlers. But I discovered the truth of communism on the internet, so I can sit on the internet and type away and call people racist and sexist all day and feel good about myself. Well, that's not real politics. That is not real politics. And that's what like third worldism is really about, right? Third worldism is a way and look, labor aristocracy is a real thing, right? I mean, there has been sections of the US working class that have benefited from imperialism and been bought off by it. That's a reality. But the reality of the period we're currently living in is the breakdown of the labor aristocracy. Those good paying jobs are gone. That white picket fence home that was the staple of the American dream of the 1950s has been foreclosed. It's boarded up. I mean, so to be screaming about labor aristocracy right now, I mean, yes, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that was a real barrier to popular organizing. Now, average Americans are ready to fight. Average Americans are against the wars. Average Americans think the government is working for someone else and not them. Average Americans are fed up. They want jobs. They want healthcare and education. Average Americans are ready to fight back. Now is not the time to say they're not ready to hear it. And if you think it's impossible, if you are in the mindset that it's impossible, we can never win over average Americans, so why even try? Stop, right? I don't take dating advice from incels. Okay, I don't take barbecuing advice from vegans. And if you think it's impossible, we can never win the American people to socialism, there is no hope. Shut up. Go learn to play golf. Maybe go join the alt-right. I don't know what you should do, but you shouldn't be a communist then, because communism is about winning. I mean, we actually want to see imperialism be dismantled. We feel we have an obligation here in the center of the empire to build an anti-imperialist working class movement. And if you don't think that's possible, I don't know what you're doing, and I don't know why you're trying to tell me how I should do something that you don't think is possible. If you don't think what I'm trying to do is possible and win Americans to anti-imperialism and socialism, then don't tell me how to do it, because you don't think it's possible.
Francis Bellamy, the author of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance, he wasn't the only radical socialist in U.S. history. Abraham Lincoln in the Union Army, he had a general, August Willock, a brigadier general in the Army, who was leading soldiers into battle. And throughout the entire war, he was corresponding directly with Karl Marx and getting advice and instruction from Karl Marx about how to wage the Civil War. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt openly met at the White House with the League Against War and Fascism and the founders of the Congress for Industrial Organizations. He worked with the unemployment councils. And they've done polls in the USA, and the two most beloved presidents that we've ever had are Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I think it's not a coincidence that those are the two presidents that have the most friendly and the most open relationship with people who think like us, with leftists and socialists. So that's something to keep in mind. There's nothing un-American about socialism. There's no reason that you can't be in this country and believe in socialism. They've done so much to convince us that our whole identity as Americans is based on the free market. And that's false. We have a whole other history. And when we have socialism in the United States, we are not going to have Korean socialism, Russian socialism, Cuban socialism, Venezuelan socialism, Norwegian or Swedish socialism. The only type of socialism that we're ever going to have here in the United States is going to be American socialism. It's going to be a socialism rooted in the progressive and democratic struggles that have taken place on this very soil. A lot of ugly, awful things have happened in the history of the United States of America. Jim Crow segregation, racism, but there's a whole other side to the American people. While every single one of these injustices was taking place, there were people who were actively struggling against them. And that spirit, that democratic history of struggle that you can find in American history, that's going to be the basis for building a new country in the United States.
I'll tell you one thing. Some people say that if you oppose Zionism, you're an anti-Semite. But one piece of evidence that shows that's not true, the majority of Zionists in the United States, the majority of Zionists are not Jews, they're Christians. All across the Midwestern United States, there are people who've had their homes foreclosed and have had the good-paying industrial jobs taken away, and they're living in an economy and they're miserable. And they're going to church to pray, to try and find some consolation. And when they pray, their ministers who are getting money from Wall Street are telling them to pray for Israel, and that's a crime. The same big bankers that have set up Israel, the same big bankers that are destroying the Midwest of the United States, they're the same big bankers that are setting up the prison industrial complex in this country, and all humanity has a stake in the fight against imperialism and Zionism.